Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes, and it's The Witch of Contradiction 2, the sequel, Electric Boogaloo. I'm going to start by reading a little side note EyePatchNotes wrote. You said, I thought about this Parley longer than I actually spent writing it, and the result is this word salad. I really ought to have composed it earlier to catch the awkward bits and streamline the narrative. As it is, this prompt contains all the raw text I wanted to mention without the refining and cutting to make it penetrable. To the summary, where 5th edition, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, has a player-accessible martial score of +2 to +6, Pathfinder 1st edition runs the gamut, +0 to +20. Some classes will fall well short of +20. Pathfinder feats generally have power tied to martial score requirements and the presence or prerequisite of other feats. Animal companions struggle with their martial scores, leading to poorer feat choices than their stats may suggest, and Eldritch Guardian fighters demonstrate authorial understanding by addressing all of the martial shortcomings familiars have compared to animal companions. Now, I thought that was a very good summary, but I am going to read all of the text that EyePatchNotes wrote, the aforementioned word salad, because I don't think it's too word salady, and this is a technical parlay. The subject of this parlay is technical. You know, I think a lot when I read through all of your parlay prompts about what the prompt is trying to do. You know, what does the person behind the prompt want? And I fully understand that the way I have parlay structured, that's actually quite difficult. You know, it's not likely that I will perfectly encapsulate the desire of the person who submitted the prompt unless they directly tell me, which oftentimes we write to find out what we want, you know? But I think that in many cases, it's interesting to just see the prompt. You know, one of the fun things about Parley is I get to be kind of a guest creator, sort of. Somebody else wrote the script and you get to see the differences in people's styles. So I think that's okay. It will be a bit complicated at first, but you know what? EyePatchNotes has left us a wonderful summary. So now I'm going to read the rest of the text of the Parley, then I'm going to read the summary again, and then we're going to discuss some points. Okay. With that, we'll start with classes, community consensus, and cost of concept, Witch of Contradiction 2. We left off the previous Witch of Contradiction 1 with two hanging questions. Why take a combat familiar over an animal companion, and what the difference between those things was, and what is multiclassing in Pathfinder? To lead with the answer, prerequisites and scaling. Unlike Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, Pathfinder casters and marshals have different accuracy with their attacks. A cleric and wizard will have noticeably different casting experiences with their where their spells overlap, and different still from a paladin. Difficulty, or DC, of abilities are also based on the parent class and not on the character's overall level. Multiclassing even once forever closes certain doors, such as the level 20 benefit of a given class, and puts the character on the back foot of both their accuracy and DCs. 5th edition multiclassing boils down to two convergences. Spellcasting classes, full or otherwise, have a forecast of the strongest spells they will ever learn. As long as they commit or multiclass wisely, or intelligently, charismatically, the game will not bat too much of an eye since spell progression is fairly constant. Proficiency bonuses are instead concept agnostic, existing on an absolute scale of +2 to +6. Most class combinations can be measured by how close they are to their final states before the elements of a game master's table, like loot drops or allowed races, become a factor. In other words, bounded math keeps numbers from straying too far above or below expectations. I'll just briefly discuss this subject a little bit more. Yeah, so I think the idea here is that in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, if you're going to go to level 20 or you know vaguely what level you're going to get to, which game masters, I think that's a nice thing to let your players know if you know, if it's that kind of campaign. You know, I plan to stop around level 15 or something. Baldur's Gate, if I understand, says, or it's known in the community that you're going to stop at level 12. That's useful to know when you're making a build. Anyway. So if you are, let's just say, playing Baldur's Gate and you're a level 2 warlock and you're going to put the rest of the levels in sorcerer, you know what sorcerer stuff you're going to get to, you know what level of spells in each class you're going to get to. Your spell slots may progress independently if they're warlock packed spell slots, or kind of normally if they're normal spellcaster spell slots. If you're a sorcerer wizard in 5th edition, your spell slot progression, the resource you can use to cast spells, the energy maybe you use to cast spells, you don't take a hit to that. You progress those the same rate, and you progress your proficiency at the same rate, because that's just not related to your class. The game's multiclassing system allows you to combine different spellcasting classes that spellcast the same way into the same spell slot progression, but that doesn't mean you can learn spells of the same level. Leveling up as a sorcerer or a wizard will let you learn spells that you could learn from just being that sorcerer or wizard level. The result is that you'll have lower level spells than spell slots. And you can upcast spells usually in 5th edition. So you can cast, your fireball with a 4th or 5th level slot to make up a little bit for the fact that you don't have 4th or 5th level spells, maybe, is the idea. And that's pretty known. It's pretty easy and concrete to think about that when you're making a character build. It's a trade-off, but it's a pretty clear trade-off. I think that's one of the strong points of 5th edition multiclassing. Pathfinder 1st edition, EyePatchNotes continues, is not nearly as accessible as modern D&D. At best, the 6 ability score-based saves are reduced from 6 to 3, only observing Constitution, Dexterity, and Wisdom. For a steep incline in complexity, Pathfinder's equivalence to the class agnostic proficiency bonus is plus 20. So every level, does it go from 0 to 20? To multiclass is to literally smash 2 class tables together and work out the redundant bits like starting skills. Oh. More to this parlay, a character's martial score measures the accuracy of their attacks. Spells such as Scorching Ray will rely on the wizard's paltry martial score, despite them being a spellcaster, while spells like Fireball, that are strictly save-based, will not. A character's martial score also contributes to their ability to resist martial maneuvers, like being tripped or grappled. This reinforces the squishy wizard mythos that a protected caster is an effective one. Just a quick note, since I don't understand Pathfinder, and that's one of the reasons EyePatchNotes is taking the time to explain this, what is the point of a spell like Scorching Ray then? It's literally just always bad for spellcasters. It sounds to me like Scorching Ray in Pathfinder is based on your martial score, which kind of mirrors how in Dungeons & Dragons it's based on rolling to hit rather than forcing the enemy to make a saving throw. But in 5th edition, the way you force enemies to make a saving throw against spells, like Fireball, it happens in the world, and they roll to resist it, and the roll is harder to pass based on your stats. That is mirrored, so it's the same basically. You're not any better or worse at it as a wizard. It sounds like in Pathfinder, some spells that involve hitting enemies use your martial score, and other spells like Fireball will make enemies roll a saving throw. That's the same, but those things don't scale the same way. I don't understand why this would be anything but terrible design, as I currently understand it, because it seems like if wizards have bad martial scores, therefore any spell that makes them roll with their martial score is automatically garbage unless it does something insanely powerful or doesn't really rely on hitting somehow, even though the whole thing is it hits. It just seems weird, or like why does that exist? Anyway, you could do a whole parlay where I'm just confused about Pathfinder for the whole thing, and we're not doing that. But I just wanted to say why I think I don't understand at the moment. However, I do want to note that I think it's kind of interesting from the perspective of, okay, so accuracy. You're a wizard. You sit all day in a room reading books to learn spells and understanding the arcane. And so if you cast the spell Fireball and a fireball explodes into the room, you don't have to be, precise. And when you fire a Scorching Ray, well, it's a bit like shooting, And so your accuracy with it would be a lot worse. It makes sense in a weird kind of way. Again, I'm just from a design perspective. It doesn't really make sense to me why you would include that in the game, in the sense that a wizard would never be advantaged to pick that. It totally makes sense from a sort of world building perspective. I don't know. I mean, of course, you could just have wizards that practice accuracy. You know what I mean? Like at a wizard college that you went to when you learned to be a wizard, you just do shoot. You do practice shooting with magic pistols that fire one magic missile at a time. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. Fighters, paladins, and rangers enjoy a full martial score as long as they stay their path, or multiclass into other full martial classes. Kind of sounds like the spell slot thing from before. They keep their martial progression as long as they stay in martial classes. Martial progression is also tracked by feats that have a martial score requirement, often +6 or +11, for example. You have to have that score, you can't take the feat. However, 3/4 casters round down their 0.75 per level score, only reaching +6 at level 8 and +11 at level 15. The same feats that are available to fighters are still available to druids, just much later, because that score progresses slower. So if a feat requires like +6 or +11, the druid can still hit those scores in theory, although you could imagine there might be some feats that have a high enough requirement that you would never hit them if you were not a full martial character. That's interesting. So this game has a system that sort of mirrors the spell slot progression thing. One of the reasons that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is so imbalanced in favor of spellcasting is because there really isn't any equivalent punishment for being a martial character. There are punishments, but they're just not equivalent, I would argue. They progress damage or get more attacks or get more sneak attack damage or whatever, but it just isn't as punishing compared to being a spell slot user who's losing their spell slot progression. And you can gain a lot of that martial power back if you pick a spellcaster, whereas you cannot gain the spell slotting back if you pick a martial character in 5th edition. This is interesting because it creates a stat that mirrors that to make it kind of a fair trade. It inherently levels martials and spellcasters as being equals in a way that they aren't in 5th edition. That's interesting. Anyway, to reiterate, EyePatchNotes says Pathfinder has a systemic round down clause. A character with a 2.75 martial score rounds down to 2, oof, making multiclassing quite costly in some respects. Okay, that's interesting. So there might be times where you're progressing a multiclassed character, and because your stat will round down, you're encouraged to do one more level in that class, just because you're going to lose out on basically all of the, martial score benefit if you don't go further. Interesting. Or you are losing out until you go further. Okay. Animal companions, represented in this table, have a curious, awkward martial score factor of 0.6. They get 0.6 per level. Thank you, mathematicians. Very cool. Druids will frequently have a higher base accuracy than their second martial body, their companion. The primary difference being strength and dexterity stats in the high 20s and 30s. We're going to come back to that point a lot. Still, because of their botched martial score, animal companions are often unable to learn combat feats quickly enough to fully stand in for a real martial class. I think that it's good to stop here for a moment, actually. So what I take this to understand is that your, effectiveness in combat, while it is a combination of your martial score and your, say, strength or dexterity, the difference is that martial score is like training, it feels like. And so you can learn feats if you have higher martial score. Maybe if and what would I have? Relatively low low to medium dexterity and low to medium martial score. If I fought a wolf in Pathfinder, I would imagine the wolf would have a lower martial score but higher dexterity. And in theory, you could imagine that evening out. If I and a fully grown fantasy wolf fought each other, we would probably both be gravely injured, or I would just die. And so, I don't know, I'm just trying to pick a decent match. And so you can think from that thought experiment, it seems like what's going on here is that the animal companions can still be around as effective in terms of just doing damage or hitting or something. Maybe that's how it works. But the drawback is that they're not getting most of the effectiveness from being martially trained, and therefore they can't really learn as many maneuvers and stuff. That's one of the advantages of being trained. You have technique instead of just smashing something, but you can get the job done by just smashing something too. Interesting. So the idea is they don't stand in for a real martial class in one way, which is that they can't mimic the techniques used by a full martial fighter, which is true to life. That's interesting. Okay. The Eldritch Fighter has a tremendous impact on the argument between familiar and animal companion because the familiar will always use the martial score of its master. It will quickly outpace the companion in terms of quantity and quality of feats. While familiars have an initially poor stat spread, a topic for another time, the math just happens to work out that they have the same accuracy of the high strength dexterity companions with poor martial scores. So it sounds like what I was inferring before is correct. the Eldritch Fighter familiars are basically the opposite of the animal companions. Animal companions have extremely high stats but very low martial score. Familiar has extremely high martial score but very low stats, and those things even out in terms of accuracy. But the familiar gains the benefit of that accuracy coming from training, and therefore it can use feats. Got it. Cool. I think. Just a few ways to say that the Eldritch Fighter specifically seems to patch in the holes that make familiars fall behind animal companions. However, the largest difference between animal companions and familiars is commitment. A barbarian level 9 who takes a single witch level will receive a familiar with a martial score of 9.5. It immediately mimics the barbarian's stats. They got the 0.5 from multiclassing into witch. The same barbarian taking druid level results in gaining an animal companion with a martial score of 0.6 and a dozen hit points at most, because the martial score is based on only the druid's martial score. While a pure druid gets to build a full caster and second martial body at the same time, that's only true when taking druid levels. Animal companions have in essence their own class with levels equal to the sum of their master's related class levels only. Not unlike spellcasting, multiclassing carelessly can result in anemic player and animal companions. We're just going to read some other related materials in the sidebar and then get to the questions. For two previously covered feats, Stumbling Bash and Reverse Somersault Throw from previous EyePatchNotes parlays, both have a martial score prerequisite to take the feat of +6. Stumbling Bash itself has a lower prerequisite for fighters, that being Fighter 4 instead of Fighter 6. Interesting, so it's easier, you can take it with just fighter levels instead of martial score, potentially. Interesting. Reverse Somersault Throw is available as soon as Monk 3 instead of Monk 8, but there are a few landmines that we will not cover here. In other words, that one you would need to be Monk level 8 if you use martial score, but you can do it at Monk level 3, just because monks get a special bonus. One of the nuances that has not come up is the timing of fighter feats. The system expectation is that all character concepts get feats at every odd level. A character may qualify for a new feat before having the opportunity to actually take it. For example, Barbarian at level 6, Druids at level 8. Because they gain enough martial score, but they don't gain a feat at that level, I think. Fighter bonus feats allow the character to qualify for and learn new abilities in the same breath, because they get them at even levels, I think. Interesting. Quickly brushing over the DCs of class abilities, the formula is often 10 plus 0.5 times class level plus relevant ability score bonus. Okay? Note the 1/2 there. Martial score progression, the firm wedge between spell lists, and the DCs of abilities all lead to a common hesitation in community discussions when it comes to multiclassing. While the character only loses 1 DC, roughly a 5% failure rate, there are a few other ways to compensate for that decision. An enemy that succeeds on their save has effectively wasted the player's turn and likely the next. Interesting. So yeah, you get punished quite heavily for losing out on the DC because I don't have this equation to put up, but let's say you're a level 5 witch, let's say, and you're casting an ability at someone. The chance to land that ability is 10 plus 0.5 times class level, so half your class level, 2.5, but then I think rounded down, you remember that note from before, so 2, 10 plus 2, 12, and then plus your relevant ability score bonus. So I have no idea how this works in Pathfinder, but I don't know, you're a level 5 witch. So if that was a charisma spellcaster in D&D, let's say you have an 18 score, which means you get plus 4. So you would have 16 to hit. Interesting. Okay. And so the idea is that because the class level is cut in half, if you multi-class, you're much more likely to have that bit rounded down. Is that the idea? I'm not totally sure, but anyway, we'll move on to the closing questions, which are, what is a player gaining by straying off the prescribed path for a class, for example? If a player falls behind, what options are available to catch up, to instead exceed in specific arenas instead of others? And what might other players be saying to affirm or dissuade uncommon choices? That's been a topic that's come up a lot lately for no particular reason. Sure, yes, we can absolutely talk about that. Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm going to be answering this from the perspective of someone who thinks about game design a lot, but hasn't played this game. And so, like, I don't know, of course, but EyePatchNotes does know and knows I don't know. And so we'll see what we can do. So for example, I feel like there's a pretty simple direction to go in for what the player gains from just not being a single class character. Let's look at a couple examples. Let's make a party all of people who listen to this parlay and who all want to make characters with sidekicks, you know, like animal companions or familiars, or a thing that accompanies them on their adventure, a friendo that they summon and cooperate with in battle. So let's make that party. Okay, so the party is going to be everyone will be level 10. I don't know. A druid that's level 10, just a druid that's level 10. We have a barbarian level 9 with a witch level 1, so barbarian 9 witch 1. We have a druid level 9, barbarian or a witch level 1, and we'll get back to that exception. A druid level 9 witch level 1, and a barbarian level 9 druid level 1. So we have a druid, level 10, full-leveled animal companion. We have a barbarian level 9, witch level 1, almost full-leveled familiar. We have a barbarian level 9, druid level 1, who has a basically unleveled druid companion. And we have a druid level 9, witch level 1, which I'm wondering if you get the best of both worlds. You can see where I'm going with this. Now, druids do not get as much martial score progression, we found out. But they still get, I think, 0.75 is the category they're in, right? Like, it's still not too bad. And so do they get the full benefit, pretty much the full benefit, of being a druid with a druid companion, but they also get quite a bit of the benefit of having a familiar from witch level 1, because their martial score gets copied over, and it's not that inferior to if they were like a full martial. Though in gameplay, because of the rounding thing, I get that might actually not be that true in Pathfinder, but we don't know. So that's my party, okay? Let's look, why are we doing this example? Let's look at what the advantages might conceivably be of all of these approaches. Basically, we have one person who did not multiclass. We'll start there. One person who multiclassed in what seems straightforwardly like a mathematically advantageous way. Barbarian 9 witch 1, their familiar inherits their martial score, therefore it's a very high martial score. We have a player who multiclassed to get a companion in what seems like a mathematically disadvantageous way. Barbarian level 9, druid level 1. And so what's going on there? What can they do with that? And we have a player that just wants 2 companions and tried to do it in a way that takes advantage of the math. The druid level 9, witch level 1. Does that make sense? I know it's a lot of numbers all at once. Hopefully giving a second better summary helps a little bit. What do we got? Well, the druid is getting the druid experience. Now, I know the least about this because I haven't played Pathfinder, and we're not really doing any game design decision-making beyond the basic. What do druids do? The player gets those benefits. But starting there, I mean, we have a player that's most of a spellcaster and gets a kind of melee companion to help them in combat. I would imagine that one of the advantages of the animal companion is that they have high health, the familiar having low stats. We were talking about accuracy before, and how the familiar's high martial score but low stats, and the beast's high stats but low martial score might even out for accuracy of attacks, but I would imagine that they do not at all even out for HP. You know, I thought of this because of how you mentioned that the barbarian level 9 druid level 1 has a companion that has very low health. I would imagine that one of the advantages the druid level 10 is getting here is that their companion is tanky. They can be an agent on their own, kind of an off tank for the party, while the barbarian is futzing about with their companion. And their companion can take some hits, while the druid is able to act as a pretty much full spellcaster or shapeshifter, whatever druids can do in Pathfinder. So, okay, pretty clear. So that's the kind of basic thing the game is giving you. We could look at the design like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition multiclassing, where the idea is that if the player doesn't want to figure out what would be a good build, they can just play a single class character, and that is intended to be good. There's a package available that is meant to work. They have a kit. It is designed to be a fun experience, and the druid level 10 gets that thing, whatever it is in Pathfinder, but we can speculate. It's like you have a pet that can kind of tank for you while you do spells. Cool. Protected caster is a strong caster. How about the barbarian level 9 with witch level 1? Well, it seems to me like it's sort of the opposite. They get kind of like a martially effective turret, at least offensively, martially effective turret to fight with them, while they are pretty much a fully featured martial combat monster, is the idea. They basically created the reverse of the druid. They got to be the druid's animal companion, more or less. With more class features, they're piloting that part, and then as the kind of drone aspect of the build, they have their familiar to be like an offense battery. You said that martial score means that you can evade things better as well, so the familiar might be surprisingly survivable, even though it can't take hits very well. Like maybe it's vulnerable to, I don't know, spellcasting, if those things are split in this game. So it kind of feels like you designed a way, using, it seems like a fairly obvious multi-class path. You designed a way to do the reverse of an existing option, which might somewhat more commonly be less desired by players. You know, many players would maybe want the minion master experience rather than having like an assist turret and they are the melee monster. Or stereotypically, melee players who just want to go unga bunga in combat don't want something as complicated. I'm not sure that's entirely true, by the way, but stereotypically that's what you'll hear people say. Again, I'm not sure that's actually true as much as a self-fulfilling prophecy in 5th edition, for example. The martial characters are less interesting and therefore automatically going to be chosen by the people who want something less interesting. Or it's not even the less interesting people, it's just the people who understand the system are gonna pick the things that have the complexity, blah, blah, blah. So in Pathfinder, I don't know. But the point is, you can kind of swap those roles. Now it gets a little interesting. We have the Barbarian 9 Druid level 1 option. This is where we're beginning to elide into the if a player falls behind, what options are available to catch up or to exceed in specific arenas instead of others. The Barbarian level 9 Druid level 1 doesn't have the advantage of having a companion that is capable straightforwardly in combat. The companion has neither high stats nor a high martial score, but they do have a companion, and I'm sure that there are things that animal companions can do that familiars can't. I don't know, just as a simple example, imagine that you cannot have an octopus as a familiar, but you can have an octopus as an animal companion. Octopi are highly skilled at various tasks. You know, the octopuses have various abilities. So, I mean, that's a simple example. Maybe an obvious example, animal companions and familiars likely don't do the exact same thing except for the underlying math. And so you could have the ability of one of those animal companions and just not worry as much. The reason you're getting it isn't for it to be a combat monster. You're getting it for a piece of utility that you want. Or, really more to the point, when you multiclassed, you weren't going for the companion primarily. It's just something that you were interested in as a benefit. A simple example would be you get a burb. You get the ability to have a flying companion scout, which you could have gotten from being a witch, but there's some other druid feature that you wanted, so you get that while still getting like a flying scout. And if that flying scout was a familiar, well, would it be that different? Again, in Pathfinder specifically, I don't know, but you still get to pick up that side benefit. To get a little bit into, I'm answering all 3 questions at the same time, but I hope that's okay. I think this is the effective and interesting, fun way to do that. I think what often happens when players criticize another player's build decision for just like not doing anything, we're going to break that down in more detail in a few minutes, but one of the things that often comes up is that the player being critical has overly fixated on one of the benefits of making the build decision, but there are other benefits. Obviously, the player just isn't focusing on those things. And so if it feels like everyone in the party, remember how I framed it, everyone in the party is doing like a minion master multiclass. So it seems like the Barbarian Druid made the worst choice. We all thought that, probably, or I understand this enough to think I understand that. If you feel like you're following along, you probably thought that. And yet it's only from the perspective of the strict effectiveness of the companion in combat. Why is that the yardstick? Like, why are the goalposts set there? There isn't really any particular reason they have to be set there. It could be that there are many benefits to this character. I don't know. Just as a simple example, it's often interesting to players playing 5th edition to try to combine druid shapeshifting with various combat benefits or spells or effects that will linger while the beast is transformed. For example, you'll see a lot of people doing like rage with turning into a bear, like shapeshifting into a bear, but then also rage. I wonder if you get shapeshifting as a druid in Pathfinder at level 1. That seems overpowered. But if you do, then being a barbarian level 9, druid level 1 seems extremely powerful in theory for that reason. Maybe it isn't for some reason, like the bear is low health because druid levels. I don't know, but you get the idea. There could be an interaction there. But then you just also get an animal companion. A lot of the time, in my experience playing tabletop role-playing games, having that additional party available, having a companion of some kind, is a lot of the value. The companion being good at fighting and stuff is potentially very powerful, but not necessarily the only thing that matters. It can be very useful to just have an additional body that you can manipulate. Even just having a random civilian in your party can often be very useful for solving puzzles or passing information or scouting an area or guarding an area or whatever. You can imagine how just having an animal as a companion could actually be pretty useful, especially if there's some other nugget for being a barbarian and a druid. And finally, we have the druid and witch multiclass. This was the player that was trying to get the full druid companion and then also the full witch companion, sort of, by combining those two things. Again, you get kind of both the utilities available. You can have one familiar and one animal companion. I wonder if there are classes for those classes, subclasses for those classes, that let you have multiple. And you get to do them kind of at the same time while getting most of the effectiveness of both with a kind of nice compromise to play a real proper minion master with multiple targets that they can control. I'm salivating at the idea that you could do some kind of raised dead thing and have skeletons or some other beast that you're controlling, some rank and file soldiers or whatever, and then lieutenants, your animal companion and your familiar, that are actually pretty capable martial fighters, and you can run a whole dang platoon out of your druid witch combo. Neat. Sounds like fun. And so the player has sacrificed a little effectiveness from a few different places to get two pretty powerful companions. They've kind of beelined that option. You can imagine that the player is playing the, barbarian witch and the straight druid probably aren't jealous of this player necessarily. The straightforward druid gets more druidiness, and while the familiar does get a good amount of power for the druid witch, the full druid probably feels like, well, I wanted this focused experience, and they get a good package, a good kit, without making really any decisions about multiclassing. The barbarian witch gets a very different experience that really isn't possible with those other combinations. They're not envying the druid witch because they're not trying to do the same thing. They want to be a combat monster on the front lines with a familiar alongside them. And the druid witch is only similar on the surface in that they have a familiar that has a somewhat similar martial score, but they're chasing something quite different. So there are, of course, various obvious reasons that those things have trade-offs. I want to talk a little bit more about the ideas from question 2 and 3. If the player falls behind, what options are available to catch up or to instead succeed in specific arenas instead of others? Obviously, a lot of this would be specific to the game, but I was touching on it in the beginning with the idea that I'm sure familiars and animal companions have different abilities. That's one thing. And of course, there are things that I think should go without saying, just aesthetic. It might feel more fun to the player to be playing a barbarian druid than a barbarian witch. That aesthetic might just appeal to the player more. The barbarian being in touch with nature a little is a design space that 5th edition explores. The idea that barbarians are kind of nature sages a little bit is interesting. I think that's fun. Welcome addition to barbarians. As long as you're trying to make barbarians not be just a choice that you make when you don't want to make a choice and you just want to smash things, which I think that's totally valid to have that. I think making those choices available is sensible. But anyway, you can do that as a barbarian in 5th edition. You get a little bit of nature magic to give you some out-of-combat utility. So sure, it might have a kind of aesthetic appeal, sure. And in my games, I do often translate such things into being a benefit. In the real world, when people see something that is a kind of united concept that they feel like they understand, when they go to a Japanese restaurant and they expect Japanese food, and they see mostly Japanese food, that has a resonance that people tend to respond well to. They were expecting those things, and so they enjoy them. People looking for something different often enjoy being pleasantly surprised, but my experience is that most people don't. You know, unless they specifically sought that out, they want what they got in for. If they go to a Japanese restaurant, they want the standard Japanese fare or whatever. That doesn't really exist, but you know what I mean. People, I'm talking about Japanese American restaurants, obviously. And so I think that if you are a barbarian druid, a nature mage, a grizzled veteran of the wilds, and you have a sea otter companion or something, that may resonate with normal people you encounter in the world in a way that being a barbarian witch, a grizzled wilds veteran with an imp on your shoulder, may not receive as favorable interactions from people. You could hide the imp, one could hide the familiar, sure, but you get the point. I definitely think that those aesthetics mean something in an interactable world. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say that just because the barbarian witch feels tactically superior, it's better in every way, even though the exact value of being a barbarian witch in a given world compared to a barbarian druid is unknown. It's hard for me to imagine such a thing being more advantageous in a generally accepted public society than less advantageous. So while I understand that theory crafting communities generally don't acknowledge such things, I kind of disagree with that. I feel like exactly mathematically calculating the benefit, yeah, that might not be clear, but there's, for me, very little question that that would be less favorably looked upon, which feels like it means something in the world. I don't know. I mean, in the first place, you know from watching me on this channel that I question the value of specifically mathematically calculating most things anyway. I question whether the game ought not to be designed so that that isn't useful, usually, and therefore a benefit that is clear but nebulous in its quantity seems not at all a problem to me as a player, but I know a lot of people don't feel that way. Now. So this feels like the point at which we should get into the discussion about why other players might be saying things to enforce the meta. EyePatchNotes put it, what might other players say to affirm or dissuade uncommon choices? And while we've gone on about that a lot, EyePatchNotes and also I'm sure lots of you have experienced this a lot, I do want to talk about it a little bit at the end of this parlay, since this is related to the subject. Having there be an in-game benefit to picking most options is important in game design, in my opinion. It's not just, oh, it's fun when you find a powerful option. It's fun if most findable options feel powerful in some way, but that is very challenging. Obviously, it's quite hard to make a game where basically every combination of things feels like it has some merit. The sort of obvious ground level answer is if you just make everything do different things, there is some conceivable benefit to combining any combination of things. And so that can be satisfying in its own way, provided that the game doesn't overly emphasize raw player power or makes it very easy to gain power for anything through some method. I think that Pathfinder and Dungeons & Dragons on their bones kind of struggle with that, because they're games that give you the power by your combination of classes and stuff, so you can't just do something that will give an arbitrary component of your build a lot more power. You may have made a decision on the way to getting that thing that makes it so you cannot funnel further power into that part of your build. Early on in the series of Parley about Pathfinder that EyePatchNotes has been doing, we talked about how I was excited by the fact that the game kind of lets you translate most resources into others. You can sort of turn feats or multi-class decisions into other things and shuffle power in the build to other spots. That's really interesting to me. That sounds fun. I think that that is very build focused. That is quite near the essence of making a build, the ability to kind of funnel power around, make opportunity cost trade-offs, and have those trade-offs be directable towards specific goals, rather than there just being a lot of trade-offs. The idea is that the trade-offs can be directed toward a specific intent, and the build can be made more general or more specific, more trade-offy or less trade-offy, according to the player's tastes, and thus they can make a build that is very close, I think, to what making a build is. And of course, the primary way that players that talk about like, oh, but that's not as good of a combination, the primary thing those people are misunderstanding is that the person on the other end is likely attempting to make a build, assert personal preference, not assert mathematical superiority. And why is it good for that to be a thing that the game rewards? So why not have a game that ideally just rewards most interesting combinations, or you, the game master, the dungeon master, if you're playing this type of game that's open-ended, why have the player's interesting combination of options be anything but of about the same power level than the other options? It's sort of just like an unfortunate reality of strict game design if an option that a player chooses isn't as raw powerful. But if it's an interesting concept, look, what all is the point of the power levels of the different options other than that the player can enjoy their experience, you know what I mean? So for example, it can be fulfilling to work in a system where there's set benefits. The player makes this multi-class and it has these benefits. But if I was the dungeon master of my little experimental party from before, Druid level 10, Barbarian level 9, Witch level 1, Barbarian level 9, Druid level 1, and Druid level 9, Witch level 1, I'm not sure I'm saying that I would take the Barbarian level 9, Druid level 1, and literally buff their animal companion. I don't know if I'm into that, because that approach is like saying that the Druid level 9, Witch level 1, didn't make a decision that the game rewards, because they didn't need to go 9 levels into being a Druid. The idea that druids kind of need to get the benefit in raw combat effectiveness for their companion by investing in druid levels is an opportunity cost trade-off. To remove that for some players is to break some of what makes the build system-y, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that it's like good that the barbarian level 9 druid level 1 has an underpowered companion. It just means making it powerful in the normal way probably defeats the point in another area. It's tempting to think that if you're playing a system, if you're playing a campaign where there isn't a Druid level 9 Witch level 1 player, you can buff the Druid level 1 Barbarian level 9's companion, because there isn't someone else whose kind of opportunity cost you're destroying, right? But I don't know about that. I feel like you as a game master are kind of breaking the promise that there is a benefit to finding interesting combinations of effects. It isn't just about gaining a lot of power, as much as having the gratification of creating a system that is good for your play experience, but which also has its own, quirks. You created your own experience with the kind of tennis net up of it being, like, relatively effective. I think that that's a fun combination. I don't think that violating that is something to be taken lightly. I'm interested, though, in the idea that you have nothing really stopping you from just making the Barbarian 9 Druid level 1s, whatever beast companion they picked, be really useful in its own way, not be martially effective. But they picked to get an octopus. Let's get some water. Let's get a canal city, stuff like that, that makes it just very relevant that they picked that thing. And that feels like it balances that kind of thing out. In that way, I think that tabletop role-playing games are really good at dealing with this type of thing. And it is sort of just plainly irrelevant how effective each option is if the game is going to adapt to what the players have to tell a fun story, which I feel like is the whole premise of these games. But it doesn't necessarily have to adapt to what the players are doing by literally just making that thing more powerful than it is. It can make it valuable in a new way, which sort of, if you had infinite time, it would be ideal to design a game, in my opinion, that just does make everything valuable in some very thorough way. You have an entire book of octopus companion plays that are hard-coded into the game or something. I don't know. But that actually has its own problems. But whatever, you get the point. So I do think that players are, of course, misguided when they're saying, this option is inferior to these other options, or this option is really powerful, and therefore you made a good choice. I don't feel that really means much. In reality, it just doesn't line up with a gameplay experience that really needs to be that way, I guess is what I'm saying. But at the same time, I do think it is interesting when you get to break down what is being said. Kind of assuming that the player wants to get power, or assuming the player wants to get power normally. In other words, that if it takes more effort, it's immediately worse, rather than it taking more effort being better, because the destination is pointless and it's all about the journey. Or the idea that there really isn't another reason to do the thing. I think, as my closing thought, that most people who are reasonable people that are worth discussing this stuff with anyway, who stumble into the behavior of saying, you know, this is an inferior option because it isn't as blah, blah, blah numbers, I think that those people are looking for a reason why this is being done this way other than mathematic effectiveness. To them, it feels like, well, you have less power in combat for no other benefit. And what they're looking for, if they're a reasonable person worth talking about this with, and if they're not, you should ignore them, what they're looking for, I think, is what the other benefit is. And so if you can explain, you know, here's this and that other benefit, well, there you go. I've often had pretty positive results. People will sometimes say, literally actually confused, what is the point of this seemingly weird team or build that you have? And when I explain, a person who explains build logic for a career, I often get really pleasant responses and people say, wow, cool, like a reason to do a different thing, which I want but didn't think there was. Yay, positive response. Why is it so often a negative experience for people? Well, I think it's very simply because it's hard to give that explanation. The thing about the power or math explanation is it's right there. You don't have to have come up with reasoning for why that's good or fun or worth doing, because it feels self-evident to people that if the number is big, therefore it is good. And so you came up with something clever because there is a scoring system for whether it is clever, and it is the power level of the build. That doesn't really exist, in my opinion, but I think that that's what people are thinking. And so, to be optimistic about this subject for the only time in my entire life, I personally think that if you are willing to sit down and put together why you want this thing to be this way, whatever that reason is, doesn't have to meet up to other people's standards, but just what is your explanation of why you want to do that? What's the story, maybe, of why it is that way? You may be pleasantly surprised to find that all but the most boneheaded gamers are going to treat that reasoning with respect, and they will be interested and maybe even excited to see, wow, like a cool other option that's reasonably effective. I don't think most people want it to be true that there are no other options. There are some people that do. What they want is for everything to be simple and they understand it, and that feels great. They understand everything and it's very simple and they're right, and everybody else that doesn't think that is wrong, and that feels good to them. But those people are completely worthless to spend time with. So you might as well just kick them out of your gaming group and only spend time with the people that want to hear the explanation. And therefore I think it can be pretty effective to just say, you know, da-da-da, here we go, here's the thing. And yeah, we could get into a lot longer what happens if maybe people are worried about the power level of your character because they feel like they need to be, because the game is being run in a way that overly demands power from the player that the playgroup maybe doesn't want to need to have. But that is a very different subject and really is just something to get into psychology with. So for now, I think that's what I have to say. This was fun. I hope you felt like I was able to cover this topic in a satisfying way. It was interesting to discuss having a little theoretical party and what the various benefits and trade-offs of these systems in Pathfinder are. I know some of the appeal for you, EyePatchNotes, is that you want to explain these things and see me parse through them. And so I hope I've been able to do that. I thought it was pretty fun. So thank you very much for your support. I'm looking forward to more of these. I'm interested to see where it goes, because we've built up quite a bit of understanding about companions and multiclassing. And the series is called Witch of Contradictions. So I don't know. Anyway, looking forward to it.